Hello everyone and welcome back to the Red YouTube channel and to a returning episode here in 2021 of the Solitary series with me, Jonathan Petts. And you will notice I'm joined by two very familiar faces, Cleigh Reed and James Lucarelli. Hey guys, how you doing?
What's going on, guys?
Hey, Johnny.
Thank you for joining us today, everyone, at home as well, tuning in from around the world, seeing people from Peru, Georgia, Italy. So really looking forward to this session. And we're kind of spicing things up a little bit differently here today. We're doing a slightly different format, and we're actually building on Cleigh's fantastic work on his recent red text, where he was looking at the red arsenal of the sensors and bodies and the combination of those. And we thought it would be great to kind of come in and have a bit of a creative and technical discussion around the different sensors that we have and the bodies as well, looking at how you can pair them together, how you might use them for different types of shooting and different styles of shooter as well. Now, in today's session, we're going to be covering the sensors and their unique creative and technical advantages and differences. And then in part two, look at the bodies and how you can rig them and configure them, where you might use a Ranger over a DSMC2 or maybe even a Komodo over a Ranger. So I reckon we kind of get started. I'm seeing lots of chat coming in. So yeah, I reckon we'll dive in. Now, one of the really interesting things when you're looking at Red's sensor lineup is that there are plenty of options to choose from depending on the different requirements that you have. We can kind of think of it like a film stock. We kind of call it a bit of a sensor stock, whereby, your budget, your lens, and your creative choices may dictate what kind of film stock you go for. Am I going for Super 16, S35, 70mm? Do I prefer a Kodak or a Fuji? Am I going for a 500 tungsten or maybe a 250 daylight? And we could kind of use that thought process to look at the sensors and how we're going to choose them. And I'm sure myself, James, and Cleigh will battle it out for what our favorite sensor is and why we use it. And hopefully you guys will in the chat as well. So I reckon we kind of get started, and we'll start off with the top of the line, and that is the MONSTRO sensor. So we're going to kind of run through a few key specs on each camera. Each of us will kind of take it in turns, and then we'll kind of dive into a little bit of a discussion about all these sensors. So the MONSTRO sensor is an 8K large format VV sensor, 4096 by 2160. So a nice and wide sensor, fantastic for spherical large format lenses. And, just to start off, large format, this is really why you come to MONSTRO, coming for this large format look, that control over that depth of field. And I mean, better than none to speak about this is Cleigh. I believe you shoot day to day on the MONSTRO.
Yeah, that's what we do a lot of the content on, from the red text to different footage examples that we do. Obviously, when a new camera launches, we only shoot with that camera. But my day-to-day functional is always on the MONSTRO. And part of the reason is that large format look. Is that exactly like you said, controlling that depth of field is huge. And it really lends to a cinematic touch to your footage. Like the idea that you can have focus directly on eyes and have a background fall off to look almost like a painting is something that really lends toward a look that's filmic. And with MONSTRO, you also get all these other benefits. You get kind of a little bit of the benefits from all the different sensors. You have a relatively large pixel pitch, which means that you're taking in light really effectively. You've got great sensor technology behind it. And then you've also got the ability to crop in to 6K and get that S35 coverage for a lens if you needed to. So I think that's why it ends up in my hands more often is it ticks a lot of boxes. And there's a reason why it's our flagship sensor.
I mean, this is the thing, when you're actually looking at pixel pitch, a lot of the time people kind of use that as an overarching barometer. Hey, the larger the pixel pitch, the better, in low light or kind of noise performance. But it's actually the technology behind that pixel which is very important. And we'll actually have some fantastic examples later where we'll look at a camera that has a smaller pixel pitch, but because of that sensor technology, it performs better than a camera with a larger kind of photo sight. And you can kind of think of photo sights akin to a bucket. The larger the bucket, the larger the surface area there is to capture rain. The larger you have a photo sight, the more surface area you have to capture light. And the MONSTRO sensor, as you were saying there, is fantastic in low light as well. And it's the ability to retain, color information when you go into those low light environments that, keeps me coming back to that sensor. And what we're going to do today is actually look at a couple of films, a couple of projects that have used each sensor to kind of see where those benefits really kind of come from. And, just to go ahead, James.
I was just going to add, Cleigh brought up a great point there about using his lenses. And for when we both go into different demos or different projects, we always like to have the best option for lenses. And one might look at a slide like this and think that we have 4 Super 35 cameras. No, but Cleigh mentioned it earlier there. You could always shoot the Monstro at 6K, still hit that same Super 35, and really we're not having to go get a different sensor stock.
Right.
I mean, yeah,
and you get the benefit of frame rates. Sorry, Johnny, I didn't mean to step on you. Get that benefit of frame rates.
Some jobs I've seen people, they'll choose a Zeiss Supreme Prime for their kind of corporate work or some commercial work, and then on the weekend they'll go shoot a short film. But maybe you want to choose some Cooke S2s, but you like the dynamics of the Monstro sensor. You can still do that, where other cameras, when you want to go into an S35 mode on a large format sensor, you're kind of going below 4K, which if you're doing Netflix and you want to keep at least that kind of 4K base level, this can kind of be where Monstro can come in for that. So I reckon now what we'll do is we'll kind of look at, some references for people to come in and go, hey, where can I get an idea of this Monstro look? And I'll just ping up some shot on red shows here. So if you definitely want to go check out any of these to get an idea of what Monstro can do. And the thing here that's really, really exciting is that each of these have such a distinct look. No 2 of these shows or films look similar. Queen's Gambit couldn't look more opposite to Extraction in their tone, their style, their look. All of these different attributes, The Witcher, The Morning Show, both of those shows, again, look very, very different. And one film we're going to look at today is called A Portrait of a Lady on Fire. Now, we've all kind of selected a film to kind of come and talk about, and I've chosen A Portrait of a Lady on Fire because this was a film that I saw in 2019. It was projected in 4K, and for me, this epitomized the Monstro sensor and shooting large format. It is shot by Claire Mathon AFC. It's a French film, so you can definitely go brush up on your French if you want to go watch that. Obviously, there's some subtitles there. But basically, the premise of the film is that this family is getting their daughter painted to basically pawn her off in a dowry for a prospective husband. And she's refusing to be painted, so they've brought in this young female artist to come paint her behind her back. And it's an absolutely stunning piece. And I think if a film epitomized every frame of painting, this would really be it. So let's go in and have a little look at some of these stills. So this is the start of the film. They've just come off the boat. They're walking up to where the house is, where the manor is. And this just kind of sets the tone for the film so well, because they bounce between low lights, they bounce between daylight environments and night interiors and day interiors. And this starts it off, we're seeing beautiful detail there. We're seeing lovely color transitions there on the left. We're seeing on the rocks there as well. But, getting a bit of a sense of 3D-reality, James, which I know you kind of love to kind of talk about with 8K.
Yeah, no, we can actually see the texture in the rock, and whether it's the foreground or the background, it doesn't look like a flat picture. We can really kind of see that texture and see the roundness. And you have some other great examples here, which really just kind of show this in full form.
I mean, where this film... Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, it's like you can really tell three-dimensionality based on the increase in resolution, and you're handling that all with great low-light performance. Like you can see in this still right here, a single candle is lighting this actress, and yet we're seeing so many details in the darker areas of frame. It's really pretty amazing. It's a testament to the DR as well as that detail captured in a larger format and larger resolution.
I mean, this is one of the things here, looking on her right shoulder and her left shoulder, we can see a little bit of detail there in the dress, where there's some blue embroidery on the left-hand side, some yellow embroidery as well. But, I mean, the thing that stands out for me here is that large format look. We're instantly drawn into her eyes here. We're instantly drawn into this smooth, beautiful kind of focus roll-off into the background, which for me is really kind of cinema. It's that control over the depth of field. Few more low light examples here. A portrait of a lady on fire here. We're seeing detail in the reeds in the background there, but also maintaining color accuracy, maintaining her skin tone, maintaining, the dress isn't pitch black. You can see there's some texture. You can see the curves in the dress and, the different undulations. Just got a few more low light examples here. Again, one source coming in from the left of frame, but you can still just about pick out some details there on the right-hand side of her face. And then the final low light example here, her holding her painting at some point in the film. I won't give away when. We can see a little bit of texture on the painting, a little bit of detail in there. And, just a few more just to round off here, just because this film is so beautiful. This one, we're instantly drawn right into her eyes here. Instantly, we're looking exactly there. The filmmaker, Claire, has gone, this is where you need to be looking at this point. And large format can really help with that, help draw the viewer into a certain area in the frame.
I totally agree. And it's amazing how sometimes the technology we choose can reinforce the messages in the story, in the storytelling that we're achieving. Like, this is such a great example of having the frames look like paintings. I mean, they really, if you look at the backgrounds, they look like soft impressionist paintings, and yet we've still got that perfect focus on the eyes that draw us right in. And I mean, looking at this earlier, James was talking about the skin tone here. It's amazing. I mean, we get great stuff going on.
You can see the translucent nature, right? The little blue vein. And I know oftentimes when I show up with an 8K camera, someone says, don't put that right in my face. But when you are trying to get that natural, visceral detail, I feel like I'm sitting on this cliff, dangling my feet off right there with her. We're in that scene.
Exactly. It's all about those color transitions, being able to go from those blues to those yellows to those pinks, all in our skin tone. Whereas, if you had, 2 pixels to go from a green to a nice pink, whereas with 8K, 4 times more pixels, sometimes 16 if you're going from HD, right. Way more pixels to see all of those color transitions, which as a filmmaker, it's great to have that ability to either, play with it in post or have it exactly how you wanted it.
Yeah, and sometimes it's tough to get that across to people. And one of the ways that I've heard it best explained is, think about Mario. Think about 8-bit Mario versus Mario 64. He seems more round. You can tell that the colors, as they transition, are transitioning as opposed to just 2 blocks of color next to each other. When you raise the resolution, you get these inherent benefits of 3-dimensionality and color rendering. It's really a beautiful thing to see.
It's a bit like one of those things where when you think of a circle on a display, it's not actually round. Like you've got to have square pixels to make up a circle. And to get rid of that laddering, you've got to have more pixels to kind of show that.
And when talking about more pixels, I think that's a perfect segue into our next sensor, which is our other 8K option, a sensor that's very near and dear to my heart. That is the HELIUM sensor. It is our first 8K sensor. It is Super 35, and I'm going to pull up some of the stats here. But from someone as myself that maybe isn't doing as much narrative and just doing maybe more commercial work or maybe for natural history, I really want to have that very, very tight grain and also have that ability to shoot with the Super 35 lenses that I currently own. 35, it's with 8K, we're actually getting 35.4 megapixels. So for all you still shooters out there, that's about 44% more than your 6K frame. We have that very, very tight 3.5 micron pixel pitch. It's really nice for also super sampling, which is a key thing here. Maybe we are shooting 8K and delivering in 4, and that's where that grain will get even tighter and begin to fall away. Now, still having that 16 stops of dynamic range is going to be huge, so we can still have that, maintain that detail in our shadows and still have that very, very high highlight protection as well. Now, I want to go through a couple of the shows that are shot on HELIUM, and that's not to say you can't have a very filmic look with tighter grain photo sites. And as I pull up some of these shows, you're going to see some great examples here of from Narcos to The Irishman to Bird Box or Mindhunter. These are all gorgeous, gorgeous shows that have, like we said earlier, very, very different look. All of them are using Super 35 lenses, and we've all talked to that DP that has that favorite Super 35 lens. I think they're more willing to maybe give up their firstborn son than maybe some of those Super 35 lenses that they've been carrying around. And
I mean, this is one of the things, James. Like a lot of people go, hey, why would you go HELIUM when I can just shoot large format 8K? And it really is that lens choice. There was a DP of a Netflix show that I spoke to last year, and he was testing MONSTRO and HELIUM, but he just loved his Leica Summicrons so much. He's like, I love the 8K, but I have to use these lenses. So being able to get that, as we're talking about 8K with what that brings in, color transitions and that downsample, that meant that HELIUM was the perfect choice for him.
Yeah, and hey, there's inherent benefits of shooting a smaller sensor too. Do you like your focus puller? is he just starting out? Because HELIUM's going to give you a much easier focus pulling experience than a larger format sensor is. And you also, I love that you touched on stills, because I think there's really something to be said when you're talking about achieving certain looks. And I shoot a lot of our product stuff, and because of that, all on red. And those product shots need to be tight all the way across the frame. They need to be in focus all the way from front of product to back of product. And I find that shooting a lot of that stuff on HELIUM, gives me the megapixels that I need, but it also puts my sensor and my lens choices in a place where I can use, you know, a classic lens like a Zeiss or a Canon that's really pretty much the standard for shooting product. I can use those and achieve that tight focus that I want without worrying about my depth of field getting too out of hand.
It's one of those things of making sure or finding additional ways as filmmakers to generate additional revenue incomes. I mean, James, you were talking about one of your friends the other day where he shoots 8K helium and he can pull high-res prints from his amazing content and sell those. You know, if you're shooting music videos, you know, corporate work, being able to extract stills and, you know, sell those on, additional revenue streams from one camera is always beneficial.
Well, time is money, and also we've had to maybe bring in the promo crew, and it's now I'm stealing my talent's eyeline match, right? Hey, are you looking at the photo crew, or are you looking at the motion crew? And really now we can just utilize that with one. Now I want to talk about our next film here, which is a gorgeous film called At Eternity's Gate. It was released originally in 2018, and the DP was a very talented Benoit Delhomme. This was shot on Kowa lenses. So when you have a very, very sharp sensor, and we pair that with maybe some of these gorgeous soft anamorphic lenses, you're going to be able to have a little bit of both, right? The ability to essentially, if you haven't seen this film, I definitely recommend you go out and see it. It's all about the life of very famous painter Vincent van Gogh. And for anyone that knows or familiar with the history, very popular painter now, but not so much in his time. And you can really get the feel for these big, vast, open exteriors that are just absolutely gorgeous and have that painting kind of a feel to it. And then they're actually kind of contrasted by, you know, putting it right into his face and really showing the contrast from when he's in society and really not feeling in his element. So it's a gorgeous film here. And it's something that really, when I'm watching it, I'm seeing both the artistic look as well as the highlight roll-off that helium sensor allows for.
I mean, this is one of the things where a lot of people kind of, when they're speaking to me, asking about, you know, dynamic range and 8K on an S35 sensor is, you know, with that 3.5 micron pixel pitch, can the camera still produce, you know, images, you know, where I have, like in this shot, we've got a really, really bright window coming in and we're still picking up detail on the right-hand side of the character's face there. You know, it's about the technology behind the pixels as well. I think, James, after you've gone through these, it'd be great to show that example of helium versus dragon. I think that would really illustrate that kind of benefit really, really nicely.
We'll definitely talk about that here. But, you know, one of the things that's so, you know, I think characteristic of Van Gogh's work is his painting style. And I think, you know, Gauguin called it that he's more of a sculptor than a painter. And you can really see, you know, the clumpy, speedy nature at which his strokes were made. And here with helium, you know, just a second ago, it was so soft, but we're getting all of that detail. I'm really feeling like I'm right there with him painting at this frantic pace, but yet when I want to have something beautiful and I want to have that soft artistic roll-off, we can really accentuate it in shots like this.
Yeah, and I think it's cool to touch on something that you mentioned earlier, which is pairing vintage or anamorphic lenses which lend a character and a softness to a sensor that's got that smaller pixel pitch and that smaller sensor size at 8K that's going to give you a traditionally more in focus looking image, kind of like I was saying with the product shots. And we don't like to say sharp because that's not really that accurate. But what you can do is you can use these vintage lenses to give character and a certain look to the images while still capturing that three-dimensionality that we talked about based on more resolution. So the increased resolution still helps you with color transitions and with the objects looking three-dimensional, but then maybe you're softening that more digital look that you get from a sensor that has these specific specs.
Definitely, exactly. I mean, I think it'd be great to bring up that side-by-side still compared to Dragon. It's really amazing, this.
And big shout out and thanks to Mark Toya for providing this. This was from his original Helium 8K Super 35 review. A really great one to show side by side, and we'll touch on this a little bit more when we talk about the Dragon sensor. But you're seeing Dragon on the left and Helium at the right in various reframes or punch-ins here. And notice how tight that 3.5 micron grain is. It essentially falls off into nothing. And I'm not advocating always doing reframes or punch-ins, but it is something for kind of like what we were talking about, Cleigh, with product shots. When the client really wants to sell their product, they're not really as concerned about the artistic look. They're more concerned about their product looking really great. And really that ability to move things over or nudge it up a bit is really what that benefit is.
Totally. And you deal with like a reducing of texture or a more accurate representation of texture when you're talking about, you know, say like our cameras have a sort of bumpy finish to the way that the metal's anodized, and it's something that we always want to portray in portrait photography is the correct textures. And so you want a small tight grain structure and the super sampling from 8K to enhance that. And helium's just been built in a way that the sensor technology is really what backs it up and makes it work. Because if you look at the micron difference between Dragon sensor and helium sensor, you'd be inclined to think that Dragon would do better in terms of low light. But really, it's not just pixel pitch, but the combination of sensor technology, processing, and pixel pitch.
I mean, actually, that brings us very nicely, I think, onto Gemini, which is kind of almost the opposite scale of that, where helium has a really tight grain structure. We actually have Gemini, which has a 6 micron pixel pitch. Now, just some quick specs here. So Gemini is a 5K S35 sensor, 30.72 by 18 mil. 18 mil, you know, look at that kind of 4-perf S35 kind of range, meaning for anamorphic work, this could be an ideal sensor to capture the entirety of the lens that you're using with it, you know, such as maybe some, you know, Atlas anamorphics or something like that. But, you know, where the Gemini sensor really comes into its own is that sensitivity. It's got that large pixel pitch, but it's also got that dual sensitivity, meaning that if you're someone who hasn't got control over the light, you know, maybe you're shooting a lot of run and gun documentary or, you know, short films where you haven't got the budget towards that, you go into that low light mode and, you know, continue working and not having to, you know, worry about, you know, I can't afford having a whole 20K come out, you know, one of these kind of lights coming in. So, I mean, which is interesting is that, you know, in terms of that question there, you know, does that mean that MONSTRO is the best in low light? It's actually incredibly close. You know, that really speaks to firstly how amazing MONSTRO is, but also the technology behind Gemini as well.
Exactly. And the goals that you're trying to achieve are really important in that question, because I think if you look at it, if you were to punch into 5K with MONSTRO and Gemini both at 5K and look at the properties, then you would see that Gemini is going to perform a little bit better in that low light, but the inherent benefits of super sampling mean that MONSTRO can function in your finish in essentially a similar way that Gemini can. But what's different is that with MONSTRO, you're shooting full frame, so your lens choices are different, and then you're also getting vastly different frame rates at that, and also that benefit starts to erode a little bit when you start looking at really challenging conditions in low light mode in Gemini. So like, realistically, I think it's a great combination because Gemini offers you full frame at these high frame rates and the ability to compensate for light for challenging conditions. So you're able to shoot slow motion in conditions that you'd never shoot slow motion in the past. And MONSTRO is really not going to offer you that specific conditional benefit. Gemini is going to be the one that does that. So it's hard to say which is better.
Kind of put some numbers on that. You know, when we're actually looking at what the 5K crop is on Gemini, that's a 1.6 crop. So, you know, or a 4K, you know, going to 120 FPS, a 2x crop, your 50 mil then becomes 100 mil. So if high frame rate is very important to you, Gemini could be the one, especially if you haven't got control over that. If you're doing sports, if you're doing action, documentary, this could really be the one that comes for you. And just to kind of finish off, I see, James, you've got a point there. With resolution, you know, if you're doing run and gun, documentary style stuff, you know, productions that haven't always got the budgets, 5K red code is so insanely efficient. It always blows my mind when I go into the red calculator on red.com and work out, you know, the data rate. It's crazy when you add that up for hundreds of hours for a documentary compared to what the efficiency of 8K red code might be.
And the point that I was going to just make there was whenever we're dealing with MONSTRO and then that Gemini question comes up of which is better for low light, there's dynamic range, right, which is the total 17 stops that MONSTRO boasts compared to 16, so more dynamic range. But it's also, I'm going to quote Graham here, 8K full frame with MONSTRO potentially lets us hide some of the sins that even dual sensitivity can leave behind. So I think that's the reason why it is our premier sensor. That's not to say, and you touched on it right there, crop factor. I go right to my Gemini when I'm in my water housing because I want all of that wideness in my lens, and I don't want to have any crop when I go down for high frame rate. So both great points there.
So let's, on that topic, have a little look at some of the shows that have been shot with Gemini. So we've got some documentary shows. We've got Big Cat Tales, The World According to Jeff Goldblum, Wild Britain's Safety, which kind of came out recently, but also narrative shows where they may have chosen Gemini because of that grain structure for something like a Rambo. You know, thinking back to the old school Rambos, all shot on film, that could have been a consideration for them. Jessica Jones, SEAL Team, Sneaky Pete, all, you know, very, very different shows again. I think there's a real theme here where every show on each of these sensors has a drastically different style. They've used the sensor and that red code 16-bit raw to really draw out that fantastic art direction, the fantastic set design that the productions had.
Yeah, and that structure can give you a really interesting, gritty, filmic look if you push it the right ways. And I think a lot of people, especially in those narrative spaces, are looking for a look like that. Like you're looking to emulate the things that film did in a way that's better for your finish and safer for your execution. And I feel like that's a lot of the stuff that Gemini does really well. For me, it's interesting because I do a lot of spray and pray. I utilize the resolution in the other cameras to the fullest that I can, reframing and cropping in and things like that. And when I shoot projects on Gemini, it's actually a cool exercise for me because it lets me live a little bit more in that sort of set life of, hey, this is what we want to capture. Let's frame it exactly how we want it. Let's make sure that our light's in the right place, and let's execute it as the frame that we want to see in the finish on set. And so that to me is like I think Gemini lends itself towards those types of filmmakers.
I mean, we can actually put you on the spot here because we've actually got some of your stills from the Gemini promo, some which I haven't seen before. So I think it'll be great if you kind of talk us through some of these stills, Cleigh.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so basically we went out to test Gemini and really put it through the paces. All of this is shot at 48 frames per second at least, and we're past sunset. So here the sun's gone down maybe 20 minutes ago, 30 minutes ago. By the end of the darker shots that we'll see in this, it's been almost an hour, and we're only using the lights on the pier. So that's why we get this really cool kind of color cast feel. We get the cool moody blues because we're pulling our actual color balance off of the pretty green phosphorus lights up on top of the pier. And so you can see this is the 100 mil Atlas. We used Atlas anamorphics for this project. Because of that 18 mil height, we were able to maximize the image circle and really get beautiful stuff out of it. This was on the 100 mil, I believe. The gimbal stuff, which is, I believe this is one of them. So this was on the 40, I'm pretty sure. And this, for me, is one of my favorite shots. It didn't make the piece because we went a different direction with the story. We kept her just on the beach. But in the original, she goes to this cool little sushi bar and has a drink, and we were able to shoot in here without people really even noticing. My Nar was there helping me out on this whole shoot. He's the man. So we basically were able to go into this bar in Venice and not really make a big impact on the people around us, even to the point where we weren't noticed that much. And we were able to capture beautiful shots like this just based on the ambient lighting in this location, all shot at higher frame rates. And so that, for me, was a huge, huge lesson and benefit to just how good Gemini can be. But also, like I said earlier, it was a lesson in making sure that my framing worked, you know, in camera, and not giving myself the option or the fallback of, oh, well, I can pad it and stabilize or move around in these ways. I still had that option with 5K being a little bit above 4K, but I made it a point to sort of experience that style of shooting, which is, I'm more of a documentary style filmmaker a lot of the time, capturing what's there, going into the edit room and kind of finding good stories that I like that mean something to me. And this one was more about, hey, let's decide on a story, let's kind of go through the paces, and then let's execute visually what we see in our heads.
I mean, this is one of the things where looking at those, and actually anyone who wants to see this, go head back to the Red YouTube channel after this is finished, obviously, and you can watch it. But it's really that it feels so filmic because of that grain structure, because that larger, you know, pixel pitch coupled with a nice soft anamorphic lens. It was just a great pairing. So yeah, it looks awesome.
Well, and for myself, I heard you say high frame rate an hour or a half hour after dark. For us shooters, that's holy grail kind of stuff. When I bring that Gemini out on set to do a time lapse or a late night shoot, the comment I hear is, that's brighter than my eyes. And I go, yeah, that's the Gemini sensor technology. But also the key thing to keep in mind there, don't punch in, don't reframe. That's a 15 megapixel total image there. So if you hear someone shooting in 3K on that Gemini, yeah, your stills are not going to be as good because that 6 micron photo sight is just so much in your face.
I mean, this is where we're starting to see those distinct choices. We're starting to see, hey, if you value punching in, extracting stills, 8K might be the way to go. But if your workflow isn't quite there yet, Gemini is so popular. So many people I've seen going for it for that reason.
Yeah, and you do have room to, I mean, let's not, like, I try not to forget myself. At Red, we work in those higher resolutions all the time. People do 1080 finishes on stuff still. So if you're looking for a 1080 finish, Gemini still gives you that room to stabilize and do all the things you would normally want to do if you're shooting, say, documentary films, where you do need a little bit of room to kind of play with the image afterwards. There really are still options. 5K is still a lot. I think we just get, at Red, we get so caught up in you know, nothing below 4K, you know, and I think people still use those functionalities. I still think keep it above 4K for all of our images' sake, because a lot of our
definitely been spoiled. We've definitely been spoiled with pixels.
Yeah, exactly.
I think we all agree on that one. Yeah.
And I think that leads us onto Dragon, James. I think you can.
Oh, we're going to go on to Dragon. Yep, that was definitely on me. So Dragon sensor, one of our previous flagship sensor, right? This is if you want to talk about film stocks and think of these sensors like film stocks, probably one of the most widely used, and it just because it's been in so many of our different camera bodies. And I'm going to pull up the Dragon sensor stats right now. And yes, it is still that Super 35 or 34 millimeters and change, right around slightly larger than that 3-perf Super 35 if you did want to have that film comparison. But I think anytime we talk about the Dragon sensor, I think the #1 comment that comes after that is the look, the Dragon look, the way it handles skin tones, the way highlights roll off. It is an infatuation that it's hard to come off of, and really just remember all of our sensor technologies are building on the previous. So I will say that, you know, each one of our sensors are getting better and better. But for myself, I own a Helium. My fiance has a Dragon X. It's something where very easily I can shoot 8K and Super 35, and she can shoot 6K at Super 35. And remember, as long as I'm finishing in something that works and have comparable lenses, I have a really easy time matching those two. So just remember, these are film stocks that you can pair with other film stocks. You just want to be, you know, aware of that consideration.
Totally. And touching on a question that came up, it's actually super important for this camera. That's why I kind of bring it into this conversation. Black shading is huge. Any of these cameras need to be black shaded at the temperature you're going to be shooting them at. And especially for Dragon. Dragon has the automatic mode that it can go through, that mode was created for Dragon to get that calibration across different shutter speeds. But it's really important that if you want to get the most out of the sensor and get the best appearance of noise floor and all of those different factors, color replication, all of it, black shade is a big part of that. And knowing your camera's ins and outs and making sure that it's technically at the settings that you want it to be is super, super important. And Dragon was the first place that I remember it starting to be like, oh, we're upgrading the way black shading works. We're really focusing on making that, you know, easy and usable for customers. But it is something that we should definitely always think about.
And remember, your monitor right there at the bottom has your nice calibration, temperature, and exposure time. If you see that T and E going from green to yellow to orange to maybe to red, definitely when you should be checking out Cleigh's Red Tech on black shade calibration. Now, let's look at a couple of shows that were shot on the Dragon sensor. And, you know, some of these are, you know, award-winning shows, award-winning movies and films and shows such as The Martian right here, or Gone Girl, or Blue Planet. And Johnny, I see one of your very close to you.
Oh yeah, Dark Crystal. We snuck that in there. Yeah, actually, that's actually a really great, you know, place to kind of speak about sensor stocks, because when Eric was, you know, prepping and testing, you know, was looking at MONSTRO, Helium, Dragon sensor, and actually decided to go for the Dragon sensor for a show, you know, of this caliber, you know, shooting in, you know, 2017, 2019, because of the look, you know, paired it with a Kippertie Gold OLPF. And this just set the look for this whimsical sci-fi fantasy feel of a Jim Henson film. And, you know, when you've got the budget to go for any camera and any lens set, but choosing Dragon sensor for that was what really made me think about the sensor stocks. And, you know, loads of those films in there have amazing looks.
And we're going to go to one of my personal favorites, and I know we all talk about it, but Straight Outta Compton, a 2015 production, but shot by the incredibly talented Matthew Libatique. And we're going to look at some of the shots here. And right off the bat, daylight, just giving it that filmic look. Look at the highlight roll off. Look at the blacks looking just so black and crushed. I think it's something that also retained very well on the highlights as well. Notice we're having backlit, dark skin tones, challenging lighting here, and we're really still retaining that very much dragon look. And here we have some very low light, practically lit scenes here, and really, yeah, just some exceptional work here.
And I love how Dragon, it helps, like we said before, to tell that story, and just how diverse this film is, where there's moments of true grit and intensity and passion, like the one we're looking at now. And then we've got stuff like when they're in the mansion and it's backlit and it's crisper and cleaner, but still feels a little bit cold, right? You know, there's just, and all of that is in these camera choices, in what looks like a narrower depth, or sorry, a wider depth of field, and in some different choices like that give us a lot to look at within the frame. A lot of storytelling can happen in the backgrounds, even if they're not, you know, completely in focus. But if you look at something like MONSTRO, where all of that stuff would be so creamy and soft that it's tough to read details when we're focused on people in front, I think that Dragon and other sensors that, or other filmmakers that are using these techniques, can really help tell the story as well in just different ways.
And that was actually, I wanted to call out, you know, because whenever we're talking about sensors, I think it's also important to talk about the lenses. So that was also shot with the KOAs and with some Zeiss super speeds as well. So something where you don't have to be limited to one brush, right? You can go out and shoot a whole project on one particular lens, but for particular scenes, you might find something that works out a little bit better.
Oh, definitely. And I think that brings us to the new kid on the block, I think, guys. And that brings us to Komodo. So obviously there's tons about this online at the moment. You know, obviously it's our latest camera, 6K S35 global shutter. This is the really big thing here when making considerations. The global shutter for me, and some of the examples I show, is what really sold this sensor for me. 16 stops of dynamic range in a global shutter, that's game changing. You know, prior to Komodo kind of hitting the market, for a cinema camera to have that with a global shutter, you know, you were kind of hitting that kind of 10, 11 kind of stops of dynamic range. And, you know, Cleigh, I know you kind of shot again, you know, the promo stuff of this. What was it like kind of shifting from MONSTRO over to Komodo?
Yeah, it was awesome. It's so interesting because like all the different tools have these different use cases. And I think one of the big things that I noticed with Komodo is just that, like, as much as our other cameras are smaller than the cameras on the market, it's about how you can use this sensor and the quality you get out of. So it's like, for me, it's interesting because the experience with the sensor, aside from global shutter, which is huge, and it's just really specific. So it's like, if you're looking outside of the global shutter, what's amazing about Komodo is it looks like the other sensors. It functions like the other sensors. It matches with the other sensors. Yet I can stuff it in places that you can't fit the other cameras. And so I think it's like, I think that to me was one of the most remarkable things about the camera, is just how I didn't really have to change my visual workflow at all. The sensor works. The sensor functions the same way the other sensors do. And I just got that added benefit of rolling with global shutter. And I think the other thing that I was surprised by is that it's been a while since I was shooting very much 6K, because we're essentially going from our 8K stuff in MONSTRO and then some Gemini stuff. And so Gemini, I know I don't usually pull very many stills from, right? So I kind of let it be for slow motion visuals and stuff like that in playback. But then Komodo, I was actually really excited about the stills, because the global shutter offered me the opportunity to up that shutter speed a little bit and use some actual strobe flashes. Now, I will say, disclaimer, it's not like it works correctly, right? So it's not like I press a trigger button and the flash fires and the frame fires.
You're timing it out, right?
I'm timing it out. So what I'm doing is I'm shooting at a speed that I tested with the physical lights, and then I'm using a pocket wizard to flash moments that I think are special. And then what that's doing is, within the footage of Komodo, I can go to that specific frame, and with the global shutter, I've got the flash actually appearing as it would if I was shooting a DSLR. And so, like I said, it's a process of playing around, of experimentation. It's not exact, but it's possible. And I think those are the things where it started really opening me up to, like, wow, I can have this in my bag. It's easy to carry around with me. does all the things the other sensors do, and it has this benefit over here.
I mean, this is the thing, you know, like experimentation. That was the first thing. When I held Komodo for the first time, I instantly started thinking of where can I put this that I can't put a Monstro, where I can't put a Dragon, because so many people go, ah, yes, this camera is small, you know, the DSM-52 is small, but I really kind of want to mount it here. And this was one of the first things I initially wanted to do, is I wanted to put this in places you just couldn't put another cinema camera. I know we're kind of bleeding over to a little bit of a body discussion here, but Komodo kind of comes as a package. It's the sensor and the body. And I've actually got a little bit of a video here. This is one of the very first things that I shot on Komodo. And actually, to kind of put it through its real paces, we shot with Monstro, we shot with Gemini, and we also shot with Komodo. So this is just a small snippet from when I went out and shot with my friends, Robbie Mead, and, you know, a small snippet of a bit of content that's coming soon, but then we'll kind of come back and discuss that a little bit. So I'll just play that now.
Do it, man.
So just a little snippet there before the whole piece kind of gets going. But there's a couple of shots there where you see where we've kind of slung Komodo, you know, actually mounting it to these bikes. And this is the kind of shot here that, you know, a lot of people saying, oh, hey, you know, I'm worried about the global shutter impacting my dynamic range. Look at this. We're backlighting the riders here. We've got a sunbeam hitting directly down the barrel, and we're still seeing illumination on the riders there. You know, being able to mount it in that situation and not have to worry about dynamic range was it actually blew my mind a little bit. You know, I was kind of coming to thinking, okay, let's give it a test and see if it can swing with the big boys, with the Monstro, with the Gemini. And oh my gosh, could it? You know, then coming into a little bit of a lower light environment, at speed, this is where that global shutter just came alive for me. We mounted it on the back of a Movi on a rider. So we had to rig a Movi onto the back of someone, and they rode down here completely freeballing it. And we just got some absolutely amazing stuff in high speed. You can see here the wheel. Those wheels are spinning quickly, and we're getting nice straight edges. You know, there's no rolling shutter artifacts here. But, you know, just as a couple little examples there of kind of stuff that I just wanted to sling it, see where I could put it, you know, throw it there, let's put it there, and, you know, small body in a place I didn't really expect I could go.
And I can see. Oh, go ahead,
go.
Okay, well, I was just gonna say I saw your Komodo in the background there on your light handheld gimbal, and that's the way that I like to be able to do it, right? Being able to go from sticks to gimbal to that modified Snorri camera that you had on your athlete there, right? Or going into the housing. I have less frames that I'm working with, but if I can get my shutter appropriately, and I saw a question come in on a stills mode for Komodo, I don't have a way to flag a still just quite yet. But if I'm shooting the appropriate shutter, right, you know, fast enough, a 1 over 40 degree or 45 degree, 90 degree, rather than opposed to that 180 degree, I'm going to have a lot better time pulling that still.
Yeah, definitely. And man, that video was awesome, Johnny. I just got to pop back real quick and say that was rad. That's really, really cool. And I think that that's part of it for me, is what Komodo and the sensor especially allows you to do is get lost in what's going on, because it still has that cinematic quality. It's doing it in ways that you've never seen stuff work before. And so but going back to how it's just like the other cameras, got to black shade this bad boy as well. So you're going to want to make sure that in any of the cameras that you're black shading at the appropriate operating temperature, right? So what you expect the camera is going to weigh. We also, you know, we do have a red tech about this, but just as a brief, you want to make sure that it's covered. You can use a lens cap. You just want to make sure that there's no light hitting the sensor when you do that calibration. And you want to wait until the camera is at a temperature that you're going to shoot it at. So if it's cold outside and you expect the camera to be cold, don't start it up in the hotel room and do a black shade where it's warm. Go out into the field where you're going to be, wait for the camera to come up to operating temperature, and then do your black shade. That's probably the biggest thing across all the cameras that you're going to want to make sure you do.
So and cranking your AC and putting your camera in the fridge isn't going to help beforehand, right? Get there first, open it up, let it warm up, right? That's a key thing too, right? Don't just boot it up and start that black shade. And I know we cover this in a red tech, and it's definitely something we could probably do a whole future session on as well.
I mean, also just coming off that, those coming up to idle temperatures can vary as well. So if you're shooting MONSTRO and KOMODO at the same time, for example, KOMODO might take a little bit longer because it's not drawing huge amounts of power. MONSTRO, 35 million pixels chucking through that kind of system, it can kind of get up to temp a little bit quicker. But some cameras, it might take a little bit longer than others as well.
Yep.
Yeah. I was pleasantly surprised on how quick the black shading was with the KOMODO, right?
It's
2 or 3 minutes.
I think yeah.
And even with, once again, we're recommending manual black shades for best results, with the exception of auto for maybe for Dragon. But guys, taking a couple of minutes beforehand to getting this right for the best overall image, we should be doing that, right? I think that's just for your best work, your passion project. Make sure you have a proper black shade, and remember your monitor shows you right at the bottom if you need to do a calibration.
Yep.
I think at this point we should ping over to you guys in the chat and see kind of what questions you've got so far. So we're going through some as we go, so feel free to sling some questions our way at the moment, and we'll go answering some.
This one's for you, Cleigh. He's looking for some examples with strobe, and I know that you've potentially shot some stuff on this.
Yeah, I don't have anything handy that I could just show to you right now. But essentially, what the difference is that with a rolling shutter, you get it's more often than not, there's a very small occasion where you might get the whole flash. It's very uncommon. But for the most part, what you get is a half frame. And that's based on the sensor exposing the pixels in a linear fashion, meaning that the flash happens so fast that as the camera is rolling through those pixels to capture them, the flash is here and then gone for the second half. So you get a hard line called a half frame of the flash, and that's what's going to happen on a DSMC2 camera, on a rolling shutter, on just about any rolling shutter. That's going to happen. With KOMODO, you get the whole frame exposed with that flash, independently of whether it was there for the start and not there for the end of that time.
And I know you mentioned controlled lighting, which is great when you can say, hey, we're either not working with strobes or we are, but sometimes you don't have that control and someone else is popping off a strobe. Or maybe it's an LED in your background that is outside of your control. So that's where sometimes having that backup, having that true global shutter is going to allow you to have that full exposure.
Yeah, I see it in sports stuff all the time, right? So there's a photographer that's getting a picture of the athlete at the peak of their move. And it doesn't really matter what sport. A lot of the time, what you'll see in the video footage is that half frame flash, and it's kind of disruptive. When you get a full frame, it's a little more natural looking. It could still be disruptive. It's still bright, right? The flash is still going off. But for me, visually, it's a lot. It takes me out of the process of watching the shot a lot less when it looks how my eyes would naturally see it. Anytime I'm seeing something that doesn't look natural to me, I tend to pull out of the edit.
Got a few coming in about black shading, actually. I think maybe we might need to loop around to some of these black shading questions again, just to make sure you guys got all the info you guys need. I mean, definitely go watch the Red Tech on black shading. There's a ton of information in there as well. But I'll just get this one from Steven here. Does it matter if the KOMODO is moving while black shade is in progress? And as long as that kind of port cap is covered and there's no light getting into the sensor, you can be moving throughout your location, or if you're moving from location to location, you can do that. Just ensure that there's no light coming in hitting the sensor. If that means, say you've got the Kipatai revolver on, you've got it screwed in, it's fine to leave that mount on. I know some people love to kind of take everything off and kind of, slap the body cap on. But if you've got a lens on, just put the body cap on that. And some people, they'll kind of put a little bit of a blanket or something over where the lens connects to the mount. That's some things I've seen some people do.
And I've got the body cap right here. Notice it's completely solid. I know aftermarket ones may have springs, things like that. You just don't want any bit of light in there whatsoever.
So look at some of the other ones. What else we got coming in? Here we go. So if the camera is not showing that it needs to be black shaded, so if we're assuming the T and the E's are green, would it make sense to do a calibration anyways?
It should always show you if you're out. I would say that if by some weird happenstance it wasn't, and you changed temperatures significantly, I would run a black shade anyway. I think the most important thing to think about is if you're dropping your frame rate below the traditional frame rates, right? So if you're doing 1 frame a second, 5 frames a second, whatever, to do a speed time lapse like they did in Star Wars and Endor, like if you're doing that sort of activity, you always want to black shade the camera. And then if you're changing temperature by, more than 10, 15 degrees, I would suggest doing a black shade then as well. But from my experience, you can always rely on the tools to tell you when that exposure is not correct.
And also,
I mean, if you're, go ahead, James.
I was gonna say, check your exposure tools too, right? Because if you check your exposure tool and you're seeing purple down in your shadows, really that's not a bad black shade. That's potentially, you need some more light in your scene or open up on your lens.
I mean, one of those things where, I remember on Dark Crystal, we shot the entire show on a studio. The temperature isn't changing by a drastic amount. So, should I consider doing it? Should I not have to do it for the entire show? And for safety, because we had time, we would do one, every couple of weeks just to ensure, hey, let's ensure that, we're getting clean and consistent pixel sensitivity. So if you can, it's never going to hurt, especially as on Komodo, it's a couple of minutes. And on the rest of the cameras, 5 to 10 minutes, that's the time it takes to set up a scene. And it's only going to benefit you as well.
I think this is a good question. We may not know particularly the ISOs that some of these shows were shot with, but I thought this might be a good one for us to open up and talk about. I know with Red, we don't treat ISO like other cameras do. We talk more about base ISO rather than native ISO. So I thought it might be a good just discussion here to ask both Cleigh and Johnny what you like to shoot. I know that with my helium in normal daylight conditions, I start at 1280, and then from there I maybe drift a little bit, but I definitely don't shoot 250 and I don't shoot 3200 or anything like that. So for yourself, what would be your guys' go-to?
Well, I can answer for the Gemini shots. Those were shot at 2500, I believe. I was just basically edging down off of 32. For me, what I tend to do is I use exposure theories to decide what ISO I should be shooting at. And the idea for me, especially with our cameras, is that if I'm going into a situation where I'm worried about noise floor, I actually cheat my ISO down. So in that scenario, instead of being at 3200, I dropped down to 25 because I knew that there might be problems with my shadows. And what that does is it allows me to look at an image that's naturally protecting my shadows with the decisions that I make. So it's putting me in a place to get the best overall information. Now, the flip side of that is true if I'm going to shoot full light daytime stuff. I might actually bump my ISO up to 800 or 1000 to be in a range where I'm naturally extending the dynamic range of my highlights. So the way to think about it is your dynamic range doesn't change. It's this range no matter what. Your ISO sets where mid-tone gray is within that range. And so if you want to expose for more of certain types of detail, i.e. shadow detail or highlight detail, you're actually counterintuitively going to want to change your ISO stop to match. And that's essentially what this graph right here is showing.
I mean, it's one of those things where it feels a little bit counterintuitive. Traditionally, we always think, hey, it's getting bright. I want to maintain my frame rate, my shutter angle, those kind of things. I'm going to drop the ISO. But actually, I've actually got a frame here that I pulled up, out the blue here because we started talking about it, and actually illustrating that difference here. So what I did is I kind of came in, I lit a scene to an exposure level that I wanted. So, in my kind of fictitious realm here, someone's waking up in a really bright environment, maybe on a hospital bed, and you want that overexposed feeling. You want the character to feel overwhelmed by light. So what I've done here is I've got two shots, one exposed to ISO 400, where you may traditionally think, hey, bright scene, I'm going to drop my ISO, and one at ISO 1000, but then with 1,600, sorry, but then with a couple of stops of ND in there. So the exposure levels are matching. So all things considered, the exposure you can see on the top two images is matching. But actually, when I come into post and drop that down, the image that was exposed to ISO 400, when I drop it down a couple of stops, is actually clipped. Whereas at 1,600, I can then come in and that detail is still being retained there. So it's definitely something that takes a little bit of time in your brain to kind of get your head around. But going higher with an exposure decision as well. This isn't something you can do in post. Just go, hey, I'm going to go to 400 and retain all this detail on the shadows. It has to be introduced with an exposure change, like an iris change, like ND, like a shutter angle change as well. So hopefully this illustrates that quite nicely.
Great image.
Yeah, and it's all about your strategy. It's all like that. You should use the ISO as a tool to gauge how you want the finish to be, and you should always be capturing as much information as you can. And so Johnny's example right there is like so prime. It's kind of tough to explain that to people without a visual reference like that because it's kind of confusing. It seems like Johnny said, counterintuitive. but realistically, that's how digital sensors work. And especially when you've got an ISO that's a range like ours is.
I've got an example. I pulled up another one, just some low light tests as well. So whereby, exposing at, 400 and 1600. I think that this was on the Gemini when I did this actually, just to kind of just go out there and do some tests in the standard mode. Expose at 400, expose at 1600, and then boost it a couple of stops in post. And actually, by exposing at 400, that actually got me a bit of a cleaner image in post. But this wasn't the low light mode. I didn't go into the low light mode. If I did go low light mode, this would have been a very different story.
Right. Yep. And so those are just some basic techniques you can use to manipulate the way that you use your camera to have cleaner images in post. And it's really not that the camera is doing anything much different. It's more that you're putting yourself in a place to make different decisions with the actual camera itself.
And I see two, we're right on 1 hour, so I don't want this to bleed over too much, but I saw two last questions and one that I could definitely touch on here when we're talking about black shading and going to different environments, one underwater or maybe a challenging one. That's where there's not one answer that's going to work for every setting, right? I don't know where you're shooting. Is it a Fiji shoot? Is it a Arctic shoot? It has a lot to do with your temperature. And if we are out in the desert, that's where maybe you could cheat your black shade calibration down a little bit more, or correct me if I'm wrong here, guys, right? Because in that hot environment, that black camera is going to have a harder time trying to get down to that target temperature. So you might aim for a slightly higher black shade calibration, whereas in a cooler environment, you might do the inverse. It's one of those things where you have to kind of think about where you're going to shoot first, and it's definitely something that we consider always before we go.
It's one of those things where when you're going into an underwater housing, once it's in there, it's kind of difficult to maybe sometimes come in and dial things in. So by using that technique, you can, prep yourself for going into an underwater housing, either that be by, changing the fan levels sometimes to allow the body to get a bit hotter, knowing that when it goes into underwater housing, that body temp is going to rise. You can maybe limit the fans a little bit to allow that temperature to rise.
Yep. We used to do a little trick to test stuff like that, or if we wanted to purposefully do the black shade wrong to test against it, just covering the fans literally with your hands and allowing that temperature to raise up based on the lack of air, and then doing your black shade off of that if you needed that higher temp to get into that zone. Wow. So it's something you can play with that stuff, and I encourage people always to test their cameras and play around with things and do different black shades at home at different temperatures to see what that effect really is, to know what your personal threshold is for when you need to stop and black shade your camera. If your temperature's rising to a certain amount and that that's going to affect your image in these specific ways, you then are making more informed decisions on whether it's time to, call time out on the shoot real quick so that your equipment's proper.
I mean, it's one of those things actually I remember on Dark Crystal, there's a couple of situations where, although we're inside, we had bagged the cameras because there was explosions going off and dust didn't want to get it into the camera. So actually I kind of put the bag in there, the camera for a minute, and the temperature rose really, really sharply. One of the things I think sometimes people may get a bit worried is when it goes yellow, it's not you have to do it immediately. It's more of a, hey, this is a consideration. When it goes red, that's when it should be, hey, you should really, really consider this. So, during a couple of those takes towards the end, it went red. And I was like, okay, we should probably re-black shade this to make sure we can shoot for a long period of time.
Yep.
Great.
Any other questions that are jumping out to you there, James?
Significant temperature changes. I would say that it's just if you can feel it, right? So if it's significant to you, if you're taking on or putting on or taking off a sweater, right? That means that your camera is probably changing temperatures at that same rate.
I use that skin test as well, right? If I go outside and I'm starting to get sunburned and blood blisters and we're out in the desert, yeah, we should probably put a tent on the camera. Or if we go out to the north and now it's freezing and I'm getting frostbite, that's all within our operating temperatures, right? So that's another key thing to keep in mind. And these cameras do go to Everest and back and down to the deepest parts of the ocean. So if you're worried about shooting on a AC controlled set, don't, because these cameras are very robust.
Yeah. And like James said, the camera will warn you. It's gonna give you a little red indicator on your temperature gauge that says, hey, problem.
Yeah. Oh, also always do one after a firmware upgrade as well. So, if you're upgrading from a firmware to a firmware, if you're one of the Komodo users and you are 1.3 going to 1.4, ensure you do recalibrate your black shade.
Oh, great point, because it can hold on to the old calibration, and it's very important that it's always on the current.
All right.
I think that's kind of wrapping things up quite nicely here. Next time, we're going to be coming back and speaking about the bodies. So Ranger, we're going to look at DSMC2 and Komodo and how all of us rig our cameras, because we all rig them very, very differently for very different purposes. So I think we'll kind of round that off here. I think what are we touching on here? An hour and 10 minutes. That's quite a nice session, I think. Anything you guys want to end with? Put you on the spot.
Thanks for hosting, Johnny and Cleigh. I think everything that you said was completely invaluable. Cleigh's our in-house, photo content and expert, and so I'm sitting here every time I'm listening, which is coming from you, and I learned 2 or 3 things today. So thank you.
Appreciate having you guys have me out and talking about all this stuff with everybody. It's really cool to have a space where we talk about some of this stuff that's a little more off the cuff. It's really tough. I know people send questions and comments and stuff to the red text sometimes, and we just don't have the staff to go through everything and kind of like be really personable. So we've kind of not been doing that, and it's great to have a forum where we can answer some questions live. It's really cool.
And just to kind of finish off here, if you do have any questions following this, do feel free to email us at solitaryseries@red.com, and then we'll be coming back for more. If you've got any ideas as well, if you want to see something specifically, maybe a black shade discussion, we'll black shade each camera and kind of go through it. Ping us some ideas, and until next time, stay safe, and as Cleigh says, go shoot something.
That's right.